Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're exploring the relationship between immigration, housing policy, and support for the far right. How does the expansion of social housing affect political attitudes, and what are the implications for public policy? Hello, my name is Alan Runick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. The far right is on the rise in many democracies, and that is a source of widespread concern. One source of support for the far right is likely to be material hardship. Many people's lives are tough, they see mainstream parties as having failed them, and so they seek more radical alternatives. And one aspect of such hardship is a lack of adequate housing. So it would seem like increasing the provision of affordable housing should be one way of countering the far-right wave. Well, new research investigates that idea and finds a mixed picture. Another key focus of far-right politics is, of course, opposition to immigration, and the research finds that increasing access to social housing does reduce far-right support in areas where existing levels of immigration are low, but it has the opposite effect where immigration is already high. So why might that be, and what are the implications? Well, to explore these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by the author of the study, Dr. Gloria Gennaro, who is lecturer in public policy and data science here in the UCL Department of Political Science. Gloria, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. I think it's your first time on the show, so it's really wonderful to have you and to hear about your research today. And let's start with the big picture, the big kind of background to your research here. What do we already know about the factors that lead to support for the far right? I gave maybe a few little hints there in the introduction, but it would be really good to have your perspective and your kind of overview of what we already know about this subject in the literature.
Yes, of course. Alan, thanks for having me in the podcast. So I think we know quite a bit by now, actually, of what are possible drivers of support for the far right. And you mentioned rightly like two big literatures that are already out there. The first one is the literature on immigration. And, many people have investigated with very good methods the question of when and under what condition like immigration increases support for the far right. We know, for example, the sudden influx of immigrants with very different maybe backgrounds tend to be really a catalyzer for anti-immigrant sentiment and then far right support. And so there is quite a lot in there. There is a second research tradition that looks at welfare states. And actually, very recently, the retrenchment of welfare state and how like citizens were left lagging behind by public services, so including housing, but not only housing. They tend to turn to the far right as a way of, expressing discontent, protest against mainstream parties, or even just attracted by, fairly generous promises that far right parties are actually putting forward in the area of welfare. Now, if you put these two things together, you get at, I think, the main hypothesis in the space where I'm working, that is the competition. Let me call it competition hypothesis, which basically tells you that rooted citizens or like native residents, if you want, might express more negative sentiments towards immigration when they perceive being in competition with immigrants for access to public services. And this is like a null hypothesis, right? That makes a lot of sense. Public services are constrained, especially housing. If you think about this, is a very finite resource, right? And people play in some sort of zero-sum game, right? If I get housing, you might not get housing, right? And so in these conditions, it's more likely that you will perceive to be in competition with someone else who's trying to access the same services. And when this other person is somebody who doesn't belong to your in-group, we call it, right? So it doesn't look like you might end up, basically picking on that aspect, on that diversity as a possible cause that you attribute the problem to. And so basically, people tend to compete for resources, and then this creates anti-immigrant sentiment when immigrants are perceived to be enjoying those benefits. Now, I think the key question for me that is left an answer in that literature is really what happens if instead of retrenching the welfare state, instead of diminishing the resources and so increasing competition, what happens if you actually try to expand it? I guess when I started this project, I would have expected that expanding a welfare state, and in this case, the provision of housing, would have reduced competition and so actually improved attitudes towards immigration. But the answer is much more complex than that, it turns out. And it really depends on what are the underlying structure of conflict in those societies. And I think this is where the paper comes in by saying that, if you want to expand the welfare state, it's not obvious that you are actually automatically mitigating intergroup conflict. It really depends how you do it, basically.
So just so I understand clearly that kind of initial hypothesis that you're offering there. So the idea is essentially that if you expand the amount of public housing, social housing that's available, then that's reducing competition between, there's more of it available for people, there's more to go around. So there's going to be less of a sense that those people are getting it and I'm not. Therefore, we would expect that kind of tension that gives rise to support for the far right to be reduced, and therefore support for the far right would also be reduced. That's the kind of core hypothesis that you were starting off with. Is that right?
That's correct. I think that was my initial hypothesis. Now, what I find in the research, and actually, the thinking back makes a lot of sense given what we know about the politicization of immigration and how the context shapes our response to the welfare state, is that this competition hypothesis turns out to be true when you actually, increase the welfare state in a context where your rooted native citizens perceive the welfare state to be for them, basically, right? So in that case, this expansion will just alleviate concerns they have around affordable housing or even marginal competition with immigrants if you want. But ultimately, this additional housing will be presumably perceived as going to benefit themselves or their friends. And this is what I find with respect to, we will go into the empirics, I think, later, but to reduction in the support for the far right in places that are basically homogeneous, right? So where I focus on France, so where French-rooted citizens mostly live.
So areas where there's not already a high immigrant population, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Where the population is basically composed of rooted French with no immigration background or immigration descendants.
Whereas you're finding the opposite in areas that do already have a high immigrant population.
That's correct. And the explanation for that is that when you have a structure of the population, like, a high level of immigration, combined with very hostile political rhetoric, as we have in the period under consideration in France, what you obtain by increasing the provision of public housing, in this case, which is perceived to be a very immigrant-centered type of welfare benefit in France in that period, is actually a revamp of this later conflict, okay? And so you obtain more public housing, but now you think, this public housing is actually not for me or for my in-group or not for my friends, but it's there for foreigners. And this is the alternative hypothesis that is what I test basically in the paper.
So let's explore that hypothesis further and the findings in just a bit. But before we go into that in more detail, it would be really interesting to hear about the research itself. So you mentioned there that you focus on France, and I guess that's partly because France is a country that has had a strong far right for quite a long time, dominated by what's now called the National Rally, used to be called the National Front, led by Marine Le Pen. But also you're looking at France because it actually, some features of housing policy in France allow you to implement what we often refer to as a kind of quasi-experimental research design in order to capture the effects of the policy. Do you want to just take us through the design of the experiment, the design of the study, and just what the features of housing policy were that allowed that?
I think the key problem of trying to study the relationship between housing and political attitudes is that, of course, places with different political attitudes might end up having very different provision of public housing or welfare provisions in general, right? So you might expect that municipalities that have always voted left-wing mayors, they might have more public housing than places that have not. And so, being able to claim there is a causal link between the expansion of housing and the local political preferences is actually pretty hard, given this endogeneity, we call it, right? So the two things are co-determined. And so I look at France because of the condition that you mentioned, but also because starting in 1999 and then really in 2000, they implemented a very kind of almost draconian, I would say, public housing policy that tried to expand the provision of public housing in all across most, let's say, most urban municipalities in France. And those municipalities that were eligible had to bring their amount of public housing to basically reach a 20% level. So 20% of total dwellings in the municipality has to be offered under public housing condition. Now, this applies to urban municipalities, as I said, but not exactly to all of them, right? It applies only to those municipalities that have at least 3,500 inhabitants, or slightly less than that in Ile-de-France, which is the region of Paris. But so there is a clear threshold above which those municipalities are subject to the policy, so they have to increase public housing, and below which they're completely untouched by the policy. Now, this basically allows me to identify what we call a natural experiment, right? So something that looks like a randomized experiment that you would observe, if we were just being able to randomly distribute public housing in municipalities. So by looking basically at municipalities that are very close to this 3,500 population threshold, I'm comparing municipalities that are very similar across many, many dimensions, population, first of all, but also, very often geography, very often economic conditions, and that only differ for the policy. So they only differ because they have either been forced to implement the policy or not. And so this is what gives me leverage to then compare their outcomes in terms of political preferences.
Great, thank you. So I'm just thinking I think it's the first time in quite a while that we've had someone talking about a natural experiment on the podcast. So it's really useful just to go through that logic and describe it clearly. So if listeners imagine, as you said, a randomized controlled trial, so a drug trial, for example, that in that situation, you would get a bunch of participants and randomly you would assign some of them to receive the drug treatment, some of them not to receive the drug treatment. And then you can see what are the differences in the outcomes for those different groups of people. And it's you know that the difference is caused by the drug because you've randomized the allocation of people to those groups. So there's no other factor that is causing them to be in one group or the other group. And so we can't do that here. We can't randomly allocate housing. But what we can do is we happen to have in France a policy that kind of almost as if randomly is allocating local areas to get the higher housing target or not get the higher housing target. And therefore you can treat it almost as if they were randomly allocated and again see what are the differences in the outcomes in these different places. I mean, I guess a question would be asked is this really entirely random? So if you're saying that it's bigger municipalities that are being treated, as we might say, with the medicine, with the policy, and smaller municipalities that are not being treated, might there be a difference arising from that could lead to different outcomes that we ought to care about?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So, if we could really, randomly allocate housing, we would not worry about that just because by virtue of randomization, these two types of municipalities would be roughly the same. But that's not the case. Fortunately, we cannot randomly allocate housing to places. And so what we need to do is to do a lot of tests to make sure that these municipalities are actually similar, right? And this similarity is measured in the paper across, social demographics that we can find in the census, across many characteristics, including their political preferences before the policy was implemented. And I actually see that, by restricting the observations to municipalities that are very close to this threshold, and I do obtain municipalities that are very similar across a bunch of observable characteristics that I can measure. Now, I should maybe mention that without getting too technical, a second dimension of variation that is used is actually over time. So those municipalities slowly become eligible over time as they reach this population threshold. So I can compare not only municipalities that are above or below the threshold, that, as I mentioned, are fairly similar, but I can also compare the same municipality before and after it reaches the threshold. And so this is an additional way in which you can control for those characteristics that the municipality has and that will not change just because the municipality has gone slightly above the threshold, like geography, for example. And so the combination of these two things give me a sensitive approximation of, what in the ideal world of social sciences would be a randomized control trial.
Great. That's really clear. Thank you. And how big is the treatment here? So you say that there's this policy that's implemented in some places but not in other places. I guess, there's lots of skepticism out there. Housing targets are announced, but they're never actually realised. I mean, do we see that there's genuinely a significant difference between the two groups of municipalities in terms of the amount of new social housing, public housing that's being built over this period?
Yes, there is. And the skepticism is actually grounded in some reality because around this policy, there has been a lot of local debates, right? And in particular, municipalities with very vocal right-wing mayors have been pretty much against it and have tried to avoid the target. Now, the policy has fairly strong enforcement mechanisms in the sense that, municipalities that do not comply, they are subject to fines that are fairly high. And what we see in the data is that on average, the adoption of public housing is significantly higher, especially as time goes by. Of course, it takes time, right, to build public housing or to convert housing into public housing. But as time goes by, we really see that municipalities that are under the policy significantly more likely to have, higher rates of public housing compared to those that are below. Now, non-compliance is there for sure, but is there across all type of municipalities and is not related to the fact that there are, municipalities have higher levels of immigration or lower levels of immigration. And so this should give us some reassurance that, at least in the data, this doesn't seem to be true.
Great. So that's the research design, and we've already given away the punchline. We've already said what the core result is, namely that in municipalities treated with this policy, using that language again, who are subject to the policy, support for the far right goes up in areas where there's already high levels of immigration, and it goes down in areas where pre-existing levels of immigration are low. How do we interpret that? You've said a little bit about that already, but you want to just go further in explaining for us how we should understand what's going on in that result.
Yeah, that's an excellent question because the result in itself is, it's pretty stark, but also difficult to interpret, right? So we observe basically these diverging trends in how municipalities react to the policy based on these pre-existing levels of immigration. This could be due to a number of factors. So my hypothesis is that this is due to the fact that in places with high pre-existing levels of immigration, the arrival of public housing kind of revamps like a local conflict over welfare. You could also think that there are other reasons why this happens, right? Maybe those municipalities are different for many other reasons, or maybe, it's just like the new residents that come in with the public housing that contribute to this divergence in aggregate voting outcomes. And all of those are reasonable assumptions, and I try to test them. And, you can see in the data that there are some demographic changes that come with public housing, but they are not enough to explain the diverging trends in outcomes, for example. You can also see in the data that with the arrival of public housing, local residents, both immigrants and native residents, equally benefit from easier access to public housing. So I have data on pending demands, basically. So a sense of, a measure of congestion of public housing. And we see that the situation improves for both immigrant and local natives. And so all those explanations don't seem to really to hold. What seems to hold is an analysis of how public housing is framed in local newspapers, which I take to be a proxy of how public housing and immigrations are discussed by the local community. And so basically what I do in that part of the paper is to build an index of association between discussions around immigration and discussions around public housing. So how often is immigration and are immigration and public housing discussed at the same time in the same newspaper articles? How much immigration and public housing are discussed in general in a locality? So looking at this kind of very simple measure of how associated these two topics are in newspapers that circulate locally in different municipalities, I see that basically the same, public housing policy not only drives vote shares for the far right, but also seems to drive this association between public housing and immigration in public discourse, in local public discourse. And so that's what makes me confident in saying that what's happening here is that there is a shift in how people perceive public housing and immigration in places with high, with historical experience with local migration.
Yeah, so I found this part of the paper really remarkable, actually. So you managed to look at all of these newspapers across France, and you managed to get local data on circulation, at least down to the level of the departments. So circulation of these newspapers, in order that you can see not just France-wide to what extent are immigration and housing being linked together in these newspapers, but you can go at the local level and to see what's the discourse in each local area. And through that, you can then see, again, if I remember correctly, that in areas with high levels of existing immigration, then there's this strong connection being made between housing and immigration, whereas that isn't being made to the same extent in areas with low existing immigration. So you're seeing this difference in how the policy is being talked about in different parts of France, different areas of France, and that the hypothesis, at least, is that that is what is driving these different outcomes in terms of voting patterns.
Yes, that's correct. Basically, what I do is to look at all newspaper outlets in France. Some of them will be local by nature. Some of them will be actually national. But I managed to obtain a local measure of public discourse by using circulation. And so what I know is how many copies of Le Figaro, for example, are sold in a specific department, in a specific area of France. And what I do is to take a local weighted average, basically, of this measure of framing, if you want, that is weighted by the local circulation. So I know if a newspaper that, for example, takes a very strong stance on immigration and public housing is sold very much locally or not. And so this is the basis of this measure of, if you want, chauvinist frames at the local level. Yes.
Yeah, great. So we have these results, really fascinating results. What are the implications? And I guess particularly what should policymakers make of these results? I mean, should they be thinking that they need to be cautious about expanding welfare provision and housing provision in diverse communities within their society, or should they be going in a different kind of direction?
Yeah, I really hope that's not the message that gets out of the paper. I think the main message of the paper is really that whenever you implement a public policy that requires, the allocation of new resources, so this can be an expansion, as in the case that is studied in this paper, but could also be a reallocation, right, of some existing resources from a policy to another. The reaction you might have on the ground really depends on local conditions. And those local conditions are actually very important to understand beforehand if you want to build support for your policy going forward. Now, in the specific case, right, of public housing, here it seems to be a story around chauvinist frames circulating around. So, having anticipated that, most likely the best measure one could take is to actually make clarity around the use of public housing by immigrant populations, by rooted natives, that would have actually highlighted the fact that the main beneficiaries ultimately of this policy were actually French citizens, right? Were not immigrant residents. And so if anything, this policy that seems to have created such an extreme anti-immigration reaction in certain locations should have created probably the opposite, right?
Yeah, no, that's very clear. And it is very striking that, as you say, the whole population is benefiting from this social housing provision. And yes, somehow it has turned out in these cases that the framing of it in the local discourse doesn't appear to reflect that. So changing that discourse somehow, it's always very difficult, of course, to know, well, how can you change a discourse around a policy like this? But that is potentially the better way forward in response to these findings.
Yes. And then, of course, different policies might require different type of provisions, right? But really, like, paying attention to the local conditions where, especially policies that have a strong physical impact, right? They're highly visible, they are very salient for the population, and they're perceived to be zero-sum somehow, right? They're perceived to be a finite, limited resource for which you might want to compete. These are particularly sensitive. Similar policies are like food stamps, for example, right? There are other things that have those characteristics of being perceived as being subject to, being like object of competition, and those are particularly sensitive in this regard.
Yeah, so this research is out now, and as is often the way with academic research, that means that you actually did it quite some time ago. Is there more research you're doing in this area? Is there further work that will take our understanding further?
Yes, I keep working on housing and immigration along those lines, and I'm currently looking, for example, at urban renewal policies and how those might have an impact on intergroup conflict between newly established immigrants and the resident population. Or similarly, I'm looking really at how in some circumstances you have like a resettlement of local populations in response to new migrants coming in. But this is still all in the process.
Well, we shall look forward very much to having you back on the podcast in the future when you have managed to complete and publish that research. But Gloria, thank you so much. This is very important research and so thought-provoking in thinking through the underlying mechanisms, the effects of the policies and the policy implications as well. Really valuable to have you discussing this on the podcast. We have been discussing the article Immigration, Public Housing and Support for the French National Front by Gloria Gennaro, which is currently available on Early View in the Journal of Politics. And as ever, we will put details in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we'll be looking at new evidence from Ukraine on how exposure to war affects people's commitment to the principles of democracy. To make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham and Kaiser Kang. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.